The flight crew told him it was just protocol. The supervisor said the coffin would be loaded like any other cargo. But when Staff Sergeant Kyle Brenner stood up in front of 200 strangers and refused to sit down, no one could have guessed the storm it would unleash. A grieving family waited on the other end. A promise made on the battlefield was being buried in red tape. And when a quiet moment turned into a nationwide uproar, everyone had to ask, how far should one man go to honor the fallen, and why was no one else willing to stand beside him? The early morning sun had barely risen over the quiet airbase in Delaware when Staff Sergeant Kyle Brenner stepped off the transport, his boots hitting the tarmac with the weight of more than just fatigue. His eyes didn't wander. They stayed locked on the flag-draped casket rolling down the ramp. He saluted, stiff and unwavering, though his heart was in pieces. Inside the casket was Private First Class Jacob Mills, a 22-year-old infantryman killed in a convoy explosion just 6 days ago. He wasn't just another soldier to Kyle. He was family. Kyle had trained Jacob. He'd written letters to his mother when Jacob was too tired. He'd held his hand as medics tried to stop the bleeding. And when it was over, Kyle had made a silent promise, "I'll take you home, no matter what." That promise was more than duty. It was his only purpose now. After filing reports, coordinating with the Department of Defense, and signing paperwork that made death feel like a delivery order, Kyle had been assigned the most important mission of his life: escort Jacob back to his hometown in Nebraska and ensure he was buried with honor. Kyle didn't wear his dress blues for recognition. He wore them because Jacob deserved it. Every polished button, every ribbon, every scuff on his shoes, they were symbols of the road that led here. The airport was sterile and cold, a jarring contrast to the warmth of memory. Kyle walked beside the casket in silence, declining assistance from ground crew, insisting on accompanying Jacob every step. But at the commercial terminal, resistance started. A woman in a crisp uniform, not older than 28, looked up from her tablet and blinked at him. "Cargo is received at Gate 14, she said flatly. Kyle's jaw tightened. "This isn't cargo," he replied. She tapped her screen. "That's how it's logged." He repeated, slower this time, "This is a soldier." She blinked, unsure of how to respond. The pause was long. Too long. Finally, a supervisor was called. An older man named Riley with a tucked-in shirt, clipped speech, and no room for compassion. He waved a hand toward the gate. "Look, I get it," Riley began, "but we've got procedures. We'll handle the transfer. You can board separately." Kyle shook his head. "I stay with him." Riley exhaled. "You can't ride in the hold." Kyle leaned forward, just enough to be firm without being threatening. "I'm not asking to. I'm saying I'm not boarding unless I know exactly where that casket is, who handles it, and that it doesn't get treated like luggage." Passengers began to shuffle past them, unaware. Kyle stood his ground. Riley made a call. Kyle waited, unmoving. Eventually, after 30 minutes of back and forth, he was told the casket would be stored in a secured bay and would not be accessible during the flight. "You can confirm once we land," Riley said. "Not good enough," Kyle answered. He insisted on walking beside it to the loading zone. "I've done 3 tours," he added. "I've seen what happens when someone forgets respect." Reluctantly, the airline complied. Kyle watched every movement as the handlers rolled Jacob into the plane's hold, taking mental snapshots of every detail. When Kyle finally boarded, he didn't take his seat. He stood near the flight attendant station, arms crossed, mind alert. "Please find your seat, sir," a voice said behind him. Kyle looked back. "I'll sit. But I'm not going to sleep. And if anything happens to that casket down there, I'm holding someone accountable." The attendant nodded, unsure of what to say. In that moment, Kyle wasn't a passenger. He was a guardian. And Jacob Mills wasn't just a fallen soldier. He was the thread holding Kyle together. What Kyle didn't know, what no one did, was that this flight was going to spiral far beyond procedures. And by the time it was over, every person on board would remember his name. Kyle sat by the window, his body still but his mind racing. The engines roared beneath him, but the sound was just a dull buzz compared to the weight in his chest. He had been through combat zones, mortar fire, and desert nights colder than anyone would imagine, but nothing prepared him for the way bureaucracy could strip dignity away from something sacred. Across the aisle, a toddler cried, a businessman grumbled about his tight connection, and a teenage girl scrolled through her phone without glancing up. No one seemed to realize that directly below them, in the cargo hold of this passenger jet, was a flag-draped casket holding a son, a friend, a soldier. To Kyle, it wasn't just another flight. It was a mission. But to the airline, it was freight. The thought made his stomach twist. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small, creased envelope Jacob's mother had given him. "Give this to him when he's home," she had whispered at the base. "It's silly, I know. But he always said letters meant more than medals." Kyle hadn't opened it, but now he wished he had. It might have given him some strength. Just then, a voice crackled overhead, announcing that the flight was now beginning its descent into Denver, where Kyle would connect to the final leg of the trip. Denver wasn't supposed to be long, just a short layover. But as they taxied toward the terminal, an announcement changed everything. Due to cargo restrictions, some special handling will delay disembarkation for certain items. We appreciate your patience. Kyle stood immediately. "Excuse me," he said to a passing flight attendant. "What does that mean?" The young woman blinked. "I believe some of the freight is being rerouted." "Freight?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Are you referring to the casket?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure, sir." Kyle's pulse spiked. "Get someone who is." A few minutes later, a supervisor named Alan boarded the plane. He wore a neon vest and a headset, already annoyed. "Sir, I understand there's concern," Alan said. "The item you're referring to is scheduled for transfer to a separate aircraft due to space balancing." Kyle stared at him. "The item? That's a Marine. A human being. You're not rerouting him like a lost suitcase." Alan didn't flinch. "It's policy, sir. The next available flight leaves in 3 hours. It will be routed directly. You can wait in the terminal." Kyle took a step closer. "He doesn't fly alone. I don't care what your computer says." Alan crossed his arms. "We're not in the military here. We follow airline protocol." Kyle clenched his fists, keeping his voice even. "This isn't about protocol. It's about honor. I won't let him sit on some loading dock like forgotten freight." Alan shrugged. "It's out of my hands." The phrase made Kyle feel like he'd been slapped. He turned away, walked toward the exit, then stopped. He turned back. "If that casket isn't on the same flight as me, I'm not leaving the gate." Alan looked down at his tablet, annoyed. "We'll handle it." "You're not listening," Kyle growled. "I'm staying with him. Or I'm not moving at all." That's when security was called. 2 uniformed guards approached, trying to keep their tone neutral. "Sir, we just need you to step aside." Kyle showed them his military escort documents, his ID, and pointed to the Department of Defense approval for uninterrupted accompaniment. "This isn't a request," he said. "This is federal protocol. If you separate me from that casket, you're violating military transport standards." The guards paused, uncertain. Alan stepped in again. "We're making an exception already by allowing him on this leg. This isn't a military plane. He needs to let us do our job." Kyle stared at him. "Your job is to get people home. My job is to make sure no one gets forgotten on the way." A silence followed, heavier than anything turbulence could cause. Passengers began to murmur. Someone asked what was going on. An older man leaned over from first class and muttered, "They're trying to separate him from a soldier's casket." Whispers turned into questions. Tension built. Kyle sat down right at the edge of the jet bridge, legs crossed like a stone in the river of passengers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "And you'll have to drag me out if you want to disrespect him like that." A nearby traveler pulled out her phone and began recording. A small crowd gathered. One voice rose above the noise. "He's escorting a soldier. You're really going to treat him like this?" Someone shouted. The tone changed. Alan's face tightened. He made a call. Meanwhile, The younger flight attendant from before, Jenna, knelt beside Kyle. "I didn't know," she said softly. "None of us were told." Kyle didn't respond. He just stared ahead, jaw tight, hands clasped. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need him to go home with honor," he whispered. "That's all I need." Minutes ticked by. Then, miraculously, Alan returned with a different tone. "We've reallocated space. The casket will remain on your flight. But this isn't normal procedure." Kyle didn't nod, didn't thank him. He just stood and said, "Neither is war. But we do what we have to." He boarded the next flight in silence. No one asked him to sit. No one offered peanuts or a drink. But for the first time that day, someone in the cockpit announced it quietly. "We'd like to take a moment to recognize Staff Sergeant Brenner, escorting a fallen service member home. Thank you for your service." The cabin grew silent. No one clapped. But every head turned. Every eye saw him. And for the first time since the base, Kyle didn't feel alone. The next flight was supposed to be short and uneventful, just a 2-hour hop from Denver to Omaha. Kyle sat near the back of the plane, his seat angled slightly toward the window, his eyes watching the workers outside load the luggage and freight into the belly of the aircraft. He searched for the casket. When he finally saw it, wrapped in the stars and stripes and carefully rolled into the hold, he exhaled through his nose. For a moment, he felt peace. But that feeling didn't last. Just before takeoff, the flight was delayed due to a minor maintenance issue. Kyle didn't think much of it, until a voice came over the intercom announcing that due to the delay, a few cargo items would be rerouted to the next flight to avoid being grounded too long on the tarmac. His heart jumped into his throat. He hit the call button. The same flight attendant from before, Jenna, responded. She was startled to see the tension in his face. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Did they offload the casket?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. She blinked. "I don't know. I'll check." Kyle nodded, his hands tightening around the armrest. He sat there frozen while Jenna disappeared behind the curtain, whispering to another crew member, then stepping out to speak with someone at the door. Minutes passed. She returned with an apologetic look on her face. They rerouted it to the next plane. "It's still going to Omaha. Just, not with us." Kyle stood instantly. "That's not acceptable. I need it back on this plane." She looked shocked. "But we're about to taxi." "Then stop the taxi," he snapped. Jenna stared at him, unsure of what to do. She disappeared again, and moments later the pilot himself stepped out of the cockpit. "Sir, I need you to take your seat," the pilot said calmly. "This flight is already late." Kyle stood his ground. "That casket was assigned to me. I'm his escort. He doesn't travel alone." The pilot looked confused. "It's being sent on the next flight. It'll arrive 30 minutes after we do." "That's 30 minutes of sitting on a loading dock," Kyle replied. "That's 30 minutes of no one watching over him. That's 30 minutes of a soldier being treated like freight. He died for this country. He doesn't wait." The pilot sighed, not out of disrespect, but out of exhaustion. "Let me see what I can do." He returned to the cockpit. The door closed. Jenna looked at Kyle, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why is this so important to you?" Kyle sat back down slowly, his voice tight. "He was my best friend. I was with him when he died. I promised I'd bring him home. All the way home." She didn't speak. She just sat in the jump seat nearby, thinking. A few rows up, a young man turned around. "Did you say you're escorting a soldier?" Kyle looked up. "Yeah." "That's intense," the guy said. "I didn't even know they still did that." "They do," Kyle said. "But not many care anymore." The young man nodded and turned back around. But the conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. An older woman leaned over from across the aisle and spoke softly. "My husband died in Vietnam. He didn't have an escort. They lost him for 2 days. I never forgave them for that." Kyle looked at her, his eyes softening. "I won't let that happen to Jacob." More people began to murmur. A man in a suit put down his tablet. A teenage girl stopped scrolling on her phone. The energy in the cabin changed. The pilot returned, looking slightly more tense. "We can't delay the flight any further," he said. "But I've radioed the gate. The casket is being moved back into position. We'll hold for 10 more minutes, but that's it." Kyle nodded once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," the pilot said. "Thank whoever called the gate and made enough noise for them to change their minds." Kyle turned toward Jenna. She smiled faintly and shrugged. "I have a cousin in logistics," she whispered. "Sometimes all it takes is asking the right way." The plane finally took off. Kyle leaned back in his seat, the tension in his spine not entirely gone, but dulled for now. As the plane leveled out, Jenna sat beside him during the quiet parts of the flight. "What was he like?" she asked. Kyle smiled slightly. He was stubborn. Always laughed at his own jokes. Terrible handwriting. He once mailed a letter home, and his mom thought it was a drawing of spaghetti. But in the end, he stood between a roadside bomb and his team. No hesitation. That's who he was. Jenna wiped a tear from her eye. "Thank you for sharing that." The rest of the flight passed quietly until the seatbelt sign turned back on for descent. Suddenly, turbulence hit. The plane jolted. People gasped. Kyle braced himself instinctively. The captain came on the speaker. "Due to weather conditions, we're being diverted to Kansas City. We apologize for the inconvenience." Kyle sat forward. "What does that mean for the casket?" Jenna's face dropped. "I don't know." When they landed, the airport was chaos. Flights were delayed, gates were packed, and passengers were scrambling for information. Kyle stood by the window watching ground crews unload bags. He couldn't see the casket. He ran to the service desk. "Where is the military casket?" he asked. The agent looked overwhelmed. "I don't see anything in this system for that flight," she said. "Check again," he growled. Jenna appeared at his side again. "I called my cousin," she said. They moved the casket onto a secure cart and locked it in the climate-controlled bay. "It's safe." Kyle let out a breath. "Then I'm staying here until it moves." "They're transferring it to a different airline," she added. "They're overbooked and trying to rearrange flights." Kyle's face hardened again. "They're not separating us. Not again." He sat on the floor of the terminal, back to the wall, watching every move out on the tarmac. Alone again, but more determined than ever. Kyle didn't sleep. He spent the night seated upright in a plastic chair near the service desk at Gate 19 in Kansas City International Airport, eyes locked on the window. Outside, darkness had settled over the tarmac, but the fluorescent lights above and the glow from the jet bridge created enough reflection to see the shadows of workers moving. His jacket was bunched behind his back, boots firmly planted on the floor. Every few minutes, someone would walk by, glance at him, and then keep walking. He wasn't causing a scene, just sitting still like a stone, waiting for morning. His body ached, but he didn't care. What mattered was knowing Jacob's casket was still nearby. He couldn't see it, but Jenna had confirmed it was in the secure bay. That had to be enough, for now. At 6:14 a.m., a new supervisor came on shift, a woman named Trina, with a tight ponytail and a clipboard clutched in one hand. She looked at Kyle as she passed and offered a weak smile, then disappeared into a small office behind the desk. A few minutes later, she returned and walked directly toward him. "Are you Staff Sergeant Brenner?" she asked. Kyle nodded. "I was told you're escorting a military casket," she added. "Yes," he said. "And I'm not letting it leave without me." Trina sighed, as if she'd already had a long day. "We've had some reroutes. The flight you were scheduled to connect through Omaha was cancelled due to crew shortages. Right now, the only available seat is on a different airline." "Is the casket going on that flight?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, it's been scheduled to leave 2 hours after, on a separate freight carrier." Kyle's throat tightened. "That's not acceptable. We don't separate." "It's all we can do right now," she said. "We're doing our best. Things are chaotic everywhere." Kyle stood. "I need you to understand something. He is not freight. He's a fallen soldier. I promised his mother he wouldn't be left alone. You're asking me to break that promise because of scheduling. Trina looked uncomfortable. You're not the only one experiencing delays. There's a lot going on. Kyle didn't raise his voice, but his tone sharpened. You're asking me to get on a plane and leave him behind. I've watched too many flag-draped coffins roll across runways without anyone standing beside them. Not this time. Trina glanced around, perhaps looking for support. The nearby gate agents were listening, pretending not to. A few passengers had started arriving for early flights, and their heads turned as the conversation grew more intense. One of them, a man in a suit, stepped closer. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there a problem?" Kyle didn't answer. Trina did. "This gentleman is escorting a soldier's remains. There's a delay with the transfer." The man frowned. "And he's being asked to leave the soldier behind." "Sir, please," Trina said, clearly flustered now. Another passenger walked up. Then another. In just a few minutes, the terminal went from half asleep to alert. Kyle stepped onto a nearby bench and raised his voice, not yelling, but firm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't mean to disrupt your morning, but I'm escorting a fallen Marine named Private First Class Jacob Mills. He died in Afghanistan 6 days ago. I held him in my arms. I promised his family he'd make it home with someone watching over him every step of the way. Now, this airline is telling me I have to leave him here while I catch another flight. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect." Silence. Complete silence. Even the beeping carts stopped moving for a moment. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, wiping a tear from her cheek. "My brother died in Vietnam. He was shipped back in a wooden box. No one was there. What you're doing, it matters." Someone else clapped. Then another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, respectful. One of the agents behind the counter stood up. "I'll check with my supervisor," she said quickly. Trina stepped back, overwhelmed. Kyle stepped down and sat again, his shoulders tense, but his voice calm. "I'm not trying to cause a problem," he said. "But I won't walk away from him." A man from airport security approached. "Everything okay here?" Kyle stood again. "Yes. Unless you're here to remove me." The guard looked at the crowd. "No, sir. Not here to remove anyone. Just here to keep things safe." He offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service." Word began to spread through the terminal. A local airport worker posted a photo of Kyle sitting by the window, captioned with a brief description. Within 20 minutes, it had over 5,000 shares. By the time someone from Airline Corporate called the gate, media vans had started parking outside. Kyle didn't want a spectacle. He wanted peace. But something had shifted. His quiet protest had turned into something larger. And somewhere in that airport, behind a steel door and stacked luggage, Jacob Mills was waiting, never alone, not anymore. Kyle didn't want attention. He didn't care about going viral or having his name passed around on newsfeeds. All he cared about was getting Jacob home. But the image of a solemn Marine in uniform, refusing to move from an airport gate, had struck a nerve across the country. By noon, local media outlets had arrived at the terminal. Reporters whispered near vending machines, hoping for quotes. Travelers paused to take pictures, though most did so quietly, out of respect. Jenna came running toward him from the other side of the concourse, breathless and holding her phone in the air. "It's everywhere," she said. "You're on the front page of 2 national sites. Veterans groups are resharing it like wildfire. Even some military families are calling the airline's customer service line demanding answers." Kyle didn't stand. He looked up at her and shook his head. "This isn't supposed to be about me." She crouched beside him. "It's not. It's about what he meant to you. And what he means to others now." He nodded once, the muscles in his jaw tight. "They don't know the full story. They don't know why this matters so much to me." She sat cross-legged beside him. "Then tell me, what happened to him?" Kyle looked past her, through the thick terminal glass, toward the horizon. "It was his first deployment. Jacob was smart, loyal, and full of heart. Always cracking jokes, always writing letters home. We were moving supplies down a narrow mountain road outside Jalabad. Intel had warned us about IEDs, but there was no time to reroute. I was in the lead vehicle. He was behind me. I remember glancing in the mirror and seeing him smile. And then, Kyle stopped, closing his eyes. One moment there was a convoy. The next, smoke and screaming. I jumped out and ran back. His vehicle was gone. Just twisted metal and dust. I found him crushed under the side of the truck. Alive. Barely. He grabbed my sleeve. Blood in his mouth. And he said, "Don't let me be forgotten. Bring me home." Jenna's face twisted with emotion. He knew. Kyle nodded slowly. They tried to medevac him, but it was too late. I stayed with him until he was gone. That night, I wrote to his mom. I told her he passed peacefully. But that was a lie. There's nothing peaceful about dying in a blast. Silence sat between them for a moment. "That's why you're doing this," she said. "That's why you won't leave him." Kyle opened his jacket and pulled out the folded envelope from Jacob's mother. "She gave this to me. Asked me to put it with him when we got home. I haven't read it. Didn't feel right." Jenna looked down at the letter. "Maybe it's time." Kyle hesitated, then slowly opened the flap. Inside was a simple piece of stationery. The handwriting was careful and neat. He read it aloud in a soft voice. "My sweet boy, I know you were scared. I know the world asked more of you than it should have. But know this, your life mattered. You are loved, and you are remembered. And someone will carry you home, not because they have to, but because they love you." Kyle's hands trembled slightly. He folded the letter and placed it back inside. "That's why I'm here." Before Jenna could respond, her phone buzzed. She looked at it, then gasped. "Kyle, look." She turned the screen toward him. A breaking news alert flashed across the display. Veterans stand sparks national outcry. Airline faces pressure over mishandling of soldier escort. Below it were photos, videos, and even a trending hashtag, #BringHimHome. "This wasn't what I wanted," Kyle said again, but Jenna shook her head. "Sometimes doing the right thing makes noise. And sometimes, people need to hear it." A few minutes later, Trina returned, her voice quieter now, her expression changed. "Corporate just called. They've cleared space for both of you on a non-stop flight to Omaha leaving in 2 hours. The casket's being escorted by airline security personally. You'll both be on the same plane. No delays, no diversions." Kyle stood up slowly, shoulders heavy but proud. "Thank you," he said. Trina paused. "There's more. The pilot has requested a moment of silence before takeoff. He said it's the least they can do." Kyle nodded. "That'll be enough." Jenna placed her hand gently on his arm. "You did it. You kept your promise." Kyle shook his head. "No. Not yet. Not until his home, and I hand that letter to his mother." As he walked toward the new gate, the hallway felt different. People stood as he passed. Some saluted. Some placed their hands over their hearts. No one said a word, but every eye followed him. Jacob's name, once known only to a few, now carried across the country. And Kyle, the soldier who simply refused to walk away, carried more than a casket. He carried a reminder of what it means to keep your word, even when the world forgets why it matters. The sun had just started to rise over Omaha when the plane touched down. A soft pink hue blanketed the runway, and the city below slowly stirred awake, unaware of the story descending from the clouds. As the wheels rolled across the tarmac, a respectful silence filled the cabin. No one clapped. No one stood. At the captain's request, the passengers remained seated. Then came the announcement, quiet, reverent, and full of weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, on board this flight is Staff Sergeant Kyle Brenner, escorting the remains of Private First Class Jacob Mills, who gave his life in service to this country. We ask that you please remain seated while the soldier is honored with a moment of silence as he is reunited with his family." Some passengers bowed their heads. Others wiped tears. Kyle sat still, the folded letter from Jacob's mother tucked safely in his inside pocket. The plane reached the gate, but instead of rolling out the jet bridge, it was met with a military honor guard and a black hearse positioned on the runway. The casket was offloaded slowly, carefully, handled with the respect it had always deserved. Kyle stepped off the plane in full dress uniform, every crease sharp, every button polished, boots reflecting the golden light of morning. As he descended the stairs, his eyes locked on the casket. He didn't blink. He didn't break. He just moved forward, every step echoing in his mind with the weight of memory. Waiting near the hearse were Jacob's parents. His mother clutched a folded American flag to her chest. His father stood rigid, lips pressed tight, tears running freely down his cheeks. When Kyle reached them, he didn't say a word. He saluted first. Then he stepped forward and placed the sealed envelope in the mother's hand. She opened it gently, recognized her own handwriting, and looked up at Kyle. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Kyle nodded. "I stayed with him the whole way." She reached out and embraced him, pulling him close with a strength he didn't expect. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." The funeral was held that afternoon in a quiet cemetery surrounded by rolling hills and waving flags. Dozens of people came, family, neighbors, old classmates. But there were more strangers than expected. Veterans from across the state who had heard the story showed up in full dress. Local officials, even a congressman, stood in silence. And at the edge of the crowd, Jenna watched from behind her sunglasses, having flown in on her own to witness the final farewell. Kyle stood beside the casket until the very end. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But when the rifle volleys rang out and the bugle sang taps across the fields, he closed his eyes and whispered, "You're home." After the service, people came up to shake his hand. Some offered words of thanks. Others simply stood beside him in silence. But Kyle didn't stay for long. As soon as the family had said their last goodbyes, he quietly excused himself and walked toward the parking lot, away from the crowd. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need cameras or applause. He had done what he came to do. The airline issued a public apology. Executives promised reforms in how military escorts were handled. Policies were rewritten. Training was updated. But Kyle didn't follow the headlines. He returned to his small apartment in San Diego, hung up his uniform, and went back to his quiet life. Yet something had changed in him. The noise of airports, the hum of terminals, and the cold edge of policies were no longer just annoyances. They were reminders of how easy it is to forget what matters. Weeks later, Kyle received a package in the mail. It was from Jacob's mother. Inside was a framed photo of Jacob in uniform, standing with Kyle overseas. Attached was a note, "Because of you, I didn't lose my son to silence. Thank you for being his voice." He placed it on his shelf, beside his medals. Not above them. Not below. Equal. Sometimes, the greatest acts of service don't happen in combat. Sometimes, they happen in airports, in quiet corners where no one's watching. They happen when one man refuses to look away, refuses to stand down, refuses to let red tape bury someone's dignity. Jacob Mills was a soldier. He gave his life for his country. But it was Kyle's silent fight, in terminals and waiting areas, that made sure his sacrifice wasn't forgotten. And as the story faded from headlines, as the world moved on, one thing remained. A promise made. A promise kept. And a journey that ended not in tragedy, but in honor.